This is the Banner Finance how-to video on creating and maintaining vendors. The main form we use for this is FTM Vend. It's a good idea when you're trying to create a vendor to first search to see if that vendor already exists. And if they do, you may not need to create them as a vendor. All you may be able to do is use them, or you may want to create a new address. Sometimes vendors have multiple locations, and you may want to pay the local vendor, therefore creating a new set of addresses for ordering and paying your local vendor might be the way to go. But the first thing, as mentioned, is to check to see if the vendor exists already or not. To do that, you search on the vendor number field. This takes us to FTIIDEN, which is the Entity Name ID Search form. And you'll notice at the top of the form there are a number of different roles. And the role that we're checking from this form, because we originated on the vendor maintenance form, vendors is checked. What you can do is go down to the lower section of the form where the cursor is currently in the ID field. If you know their ID, you can put that in and search for it. If you don't know their name, you can use the last name if it's a person or if it's a company. The company name will be entirely in the last name field. If it's a person, you also have the option of adding a first name and a middle name. There's an entity indicator, which would be P for person type vendors or a C for non-person type vendors. And there are a few other fields, V for vendor, which is the one that we are most concerned about at this point. But normally you'll come to this form and you'll key in some portion of the last name to make sure they exist or not. In this case, I was going to set up the Somerville Grill. So let me check to see if they've been set up in Banner at all. And this search will take place to see if they're actually a vendor. The wildcard of a % says, if that's first, says I don't care what comes before the specific values I enter. So it can be the beginning of the word or somewhere in the middle of the word. And I put a % at the end because Somerville may not be the last word. So by placing a % at the beginning and the end of a piece of text, it will search for that anywhere in the last name field, wherever it resides. Please note that the vendor name fields are one of the few places where upper and lower case can be used. We recommend using upper and lower case as a standard. Upper and lower case are searched for uniquely in Banner. So once you type in your search criteria, you execute your query, and any potential results return. As you see currently in our database, the only Somerville that has been returned are a couple of people. Now we know that it's only 2 people even though there are multiple IDs by looking at the change indicator. An I indicator under the change means it's an ID change. If there had been a name change, we would see an N value in the change field. We see that they are all currently set up as vendors. They are all an entity type of P, which means they're persons. So our Somerville Grill company that we want to enter is not in Banner. We know that we don't have the chance of creating a duplicate ID for a particular company, which is ideal. Because we're creating a brand new entity, and because there are some other features in Banner that help us avoid creating duplicate entities, we first want to click on the Generate ID icon. What this will do is it will take us to another set of forms. The GOA-MTCH form is the common matching entry. It tells us that the system is going to generate an ID for us. we want to use some matching source records that have been predefined at the LCTCS to help check against existing entity records to see if there's something already in place for this. It may not be the name, it could be the address, the city and state, other different pieces of information that are in these rules. There are a multiple set of rules. Unfortunately, the finance non-person and person records are not currently populated, so we need to scroll down a little bit farther and just create a non-person or a person record. So because this is a company, we want to use the non-person set of rules. When we do a next block, the system will know to go to the non-person name field, not the person name fields. If it were a person, we would enter last name, first name, middle name, or initial. But because we know it's a non-person, it takes us over to the non-person name. And we would enter the name of the entity the way we want to see it on all formal documents. So in this case, I'm going to call it the Somerville Grill. And as you tab through, you want to fill out as many of these fields as you are aware of to aid the common matching process, searching for duplicates. So if you have a tax ID, you can enter that in. If it were a person, you can put a birth date, a gender. If you know the phone number, you give it a type. In this case, we're going to use a business type. Don't use dashes because the system will automatically punctuate it for us. If you want to enter an email address, you can. You can do alternate IDs. As you tab through, you'll see it will then take us over to the address type, and we can enter the street address. Now in production, we have a clean address module set up, which helps to make sure that the zip code, the county, and the nation are cleared, and the zip code ties to the address, and also make sure that the address is valid. In this case, in our pre-prod system, we do not have the clean address set up. Once you key in as much information as you are aware of, click on the duplicate check icon and let the system go out to see if options exist. In this case, it says no matches were found. Do you want to create this as a new vendor? And we can say yes. If there were possible matches, in the lower right hand side of the form, you would get a list of existing entity records with their IDs and some other information that you could review to see if the vendor already exists in Banner as an entity. They may or may not already be set up as a vendor, but you're going to have any potential matches displayed. But since there are no matches for this, we're going to go ahead and create this as a new vendor. It tells us which components are created, which components may not be created. An identification record was created. Biographical information was created for a non-person. An address, telephone, and email records were created. It's only so many characters, but an additional ID was not created for this vendor. We'll say OK. We are returned to FTM Vend, and if you tab, you'll see that the vendor name appears. If it were a person, you would see the person's name on that line. We go to next block to go into the detail records for a vendor. At this point in time, if you want to backdate the vendor, you could, otherwise it defaults to system date. And as you tab through, you see that you can enter miscellaneous information. For defaulting addresses for purchasing and accounts payable, you can put in the type and the sequence number. In this case, we only entered one address so far. It's the business address, sequence number 1. We can use that for both AP and purchasing. The information down here is default information. Normally it's not entered. We can do a next block to move through these tabs, or we can simply click on the tab icon. We're not doing tax collection from this vendor. We do have a ID on here. This tax form status is if we have the W-9, we can record when the W-9 was added to this vendor. And we'll use today's date, assuming we have the W-9 here on the desk in front of us. Since this is a New York address, we'll call this an out-of-state vendor. You want to make sure on invoice grouping, the default is many invoices per check. So if you had 3 or 4 invoices that were all payable at one time, and you want to combine them on a single check, leave that as the default. In very few cases, vendors will request that we provide them with a separate check for each invoice. If that's the case, we would make a change. The system allows us to do 1 invoice per check. However, we should normally retain the many invoices per check value. We can assign vendor types. There is a list of those that you can locate on the drop-down. If you want to mark them as being minority-owned, disabled, veteran, you can mark several of these codes. As you see, there are several values here. Is it a small business, veteran-owned? Is it a state contract? Different values that might aid in reporting in the future. Alright? This is optional. If you come to the address tab, you'll notice that our business sequence tab number 1 is the only address. If we wanted to add an additional address, we would do a next record, and we would have to put an address type and a sequence. If we wanted to add a second business address, we could do that. If we wanted to add a different address type and make it sequence number 1, we can do that as well. When it's time to change an address, you can come here and change this address. However, remember, some vendors have multiple addresses within the state. You should double check with your vendor to make sure that any changes are permanent changes and they apply across all of our institutions. If there were multiple addresses, the scroll bar would display not full, and you can scroll down and locate the different versions of the address and change the appropriate one. You can also go to the email form, and if there were a change on the email address or an additional one, you can either add it or you can change it here. Once you're done and you're sure all the information is correct, you do a save. Now, when you need to go in and maintain a vendor, you would also go to FTM Vend. You type in the vendor ID, you do next block, and you would just change, update whatever the appropriate fields are. And click Save. And you see that the transaction is complete. The change has been applied and saved. That's all there is to maintaining vendor information. The one exception to maintaining vendor information is changing the vendor's name. In that case, we need to use a different form. FOAIDEN, FOAIDEN, is the form we use to change a vendor's name. On FOAIDEN, you type in the vendor ID, you do a next block, and it will pull up the information that's appropriate. Here's the tax ID. This is not a person, so there's no information in this block. However, down at the bottom, you'll see that there is the current vendor name. In order to change it, you go to that area, and we'll get rid of the word the, and we click Save. And you'll see that the transaction is complete, the record is applied and saved, and the new official name of the vendor is Somerville Grill. The word the has been removed. You can validate this by going to the alternate ID form And if you had made a name change or an ID change, it would show the type and it would show what the old value was. Alright, the old value was the Somerville Grill. The new value on the current identification tab is Somerville Grill. If we roll back and we do a search on Somerville like we did initially when we were checking to see if they existed or not, you are given a choice of searching by person or non-person. We know this is a non-person, so we're going to choose that search. And on this page, we put in our %Somerville, % and execute the query. And we'll see that there are two records out here. They both have the same ID, and we see that one has a name change, that's the old one, and this one is just Somerville Grill. So if you did a search on the space Somerville or the space SUM, we would find the vendor, and when we selected it, it would return and the name would be Somerville Grill. That way you're using the current name on all current documents. There's one thing I want you to be aware of. It is not possible to change a person vendor to a non-person type of a vendor. It is not possible to change a person vendor to a non-person vendor. How do we delete a vendor? While it's not done frequently, if we need to delete a vendor, we would go to FTM Vend, put in the vendor ID, do a next block, and we would put in a termination date. And when we save, this vendor is now terminated and can no longer be used within Banner. It is possible to turn a student or an employee who's already set up in Banner into a vendor. You need to do this in case a student is eligible for a refund or if an employee is eligible for reimbursement of some sort. The student or the employee may already exist in Banner for HR or for the student system, but they may not be defined in finance as a vendor role. It's fairly simple to do this. Since most of the information is already in Banner, it will be simpler than creating a vendor from scratch. The first thing you would do is go to FOADN. On FOADN, you would click on the ID and check for the person. Just like any other search, you can use wildcards. And execute the query. The goal is to find the ID. Alright, it's usually best to jot down the ID. You go to FTM Vend and enter the ID, and when you press tab, you'll see it brings the person information back to the appropriate name fields. You would then do a next block and enter the vendor information just like creating a vendor at the beginning of this video. If they already exist, you may want to change certain data, maybe addresses, other things of that nature, but it is an easy matter to turn a student or an employee into a vendor. Thanks for watching.